Released in August of 2017 was Sonic Mania, one of the greatest Sonic games ever made and arguably the best Sonic game of the last 20 years. However, just a few months later in November, Sonic Forces would be released. And Sonic Forces is quite a divisive Sonic title. Some people think it's pretty cool and some people think it's one of the worst Sonic games ever made. Granted, I think most of this hate just comes from the fact that Sonic Forces was released so close to Sonic Mania, and people would just much rather play Sonic Mania, which, as I said, is a great game. People would just much rather play Mania as opposed to Forces. But Sonic Forces is a modern 3D Sonic game developed by the Sonic team, and this game proved to be quite interesting. Now, from a gameplay perspective, and the big 3D open levels like this when you're playing as Sonic is mostly identical to Sonic Colors. You use the bumpers and the springs to elevate you, and then you also have the wisps which return, and then the boost meter, as well as the homing attack. But this game did something particularly interesting in the fact that you don't really play as Sonic that much in this game. Of course, you still can play as Sonic, but if you look at the story of this game, Sonic was very promptly and quickly defeated by Eggman's army. And he's been kidnapped by Robotnik, and now everybody's like, well, we've been overwhelmed. Eggman's forces have taken over the entire planet. So what do we do now? And it's an interesting premise for a Sonic game, where Sonic just gets defeated very quickly. So, in this game, you play, for the most part, as an avatar, which is basically just an original character that you create. Now, the Sonic fandom has been making OCs for years now, probably since Sonic was first created. So this is basically the Sonic OC game creator. But as I said, in terms of story, Knuckles and Silver and Rouge and Tails and Amy, everybody all gets together to say, okay, we need to take down Robotnik, we need to free Sonic, and it's kind of unique. Getting into the avatar creation, I didn't mind the avatar creation. Of course, I've done stuff like this since I was a kid. I've always created my own custom Sonic characters. Unfortunately, you're not going to see Kai the Hedgehog showing up because I decided to create like a werewolf instead because it was kind of cool. Of course, you can change the color, you can change your clothing items, and naturally, playing through the game, progressing through the story will unlock you brand new customization items, not only for your avatar, but also for other avatars that you can create later on once you beat the game. So, I love the customization stuff. I think it's pretty cool. And of course, like every other Sonic game, completion of levels will give you a rank system, and there's also red rings to collect. However, this game doesn't have as much replayability as, say, Sonic Colors. We'll get into that a little bit later. Completing levels does unlock brand new customization items such as hats, shirts, gloves, shoes, and even bodysuits that you can wear. And honestly, I really liked just customizing my custom character, I think it was a werewolf, and making them look kind of cool. So when you're playing as your avatar, which you spend most of the game doing, you have access to a Wispon, which is basically a wisp weapon. I use the flamethrower for most of the game because I found it to be the most reliable, but you also do have access to the homing attack. The Wispons do make this game pretty easy, especially the flamethrower that I had. Like, it's not much of a challenge. And then this game also does have the wisps from Sonic Colors that do return. And the wisps are different in this game. There's like a burst wisp, which just kind of allows you to jump into the air and basically fly for short periods of time. And there's also a few other ones. There's a drill wisp, which functions differently than it did in Sonic Colors. And there's a few other wisps as well. But for the most part, I just used the same burst wisp for most of the game. And there's the burst in action. So you get like these short hops in the air. It does run out fairly quickly, so you can't just use it whenever you want. So playing as your avatar is pretty fine. And then you also have Classic Sonic. And I do believe this is the same Sonic from Sonic Mania. I don't know what it was, but playing as Classic Sonic in Forces just, it felt a little off. I don't know if it's just because the physics is just a little wonky or whatever it might be, but it didn't feel that great to play as Classic Sonic. I would just much rather play as my avatar or modern Sonic in this here Sonic the Hedgehog video game. But, you know, there's Classic Sonic who comes and helps to rescue the modern Sonic and all that stuff. And one thing I did notice about getting the S ranks in the Classic Sonic levels, they're pretty lenient about getting the S ranks in this game. It's not as strict as it was in like Sonic Colors on some of the levels. But anyway, the on-rail stuff does return from Sonic Colors as well. I'm sure it may have been in the others older Sonic games too, but I played Colors before this, so that's what I'm comparing it to. But this game does have a couple of familiar areas, such as Chemical Plant Zone and Green Hill Zone. Of course, the interiors in this game are pretty well designed, but the level designs really were not that memorable. It wasn't as memorable as, say, Sonic Colors, where Aquarium Park or Asteroid Coaster or even Tropical Resort are very familiar locations. You can't forget Sweet Mountain. Those areas were really beautifully designed, but for Sonic Forces, it's just like a desert. Occasionally, from time to time, you and Sonic, I guess you being the Avatar, will actually work together and team up for certain levels, but it's basically just like Tails and Sonic 2, where he just kind of follows you around all the time. You do get these big double boost sections, which you have to mash a button in order to activate. These are just cutscenes. You don't actually press any buttons here, which is kind of lame. But whenever you and Sonic complete a level together, you do get a ranking system, as with every other level in this game, regardless of whether you're playing as Sonic or your Avatar, or even classic Sonic. I guess I should say modern Sonic to specify it. Getting back to some of the classic Sonic levels, such as Chemical Plant, I thought these were kind of cool. I mean, obviously, it's not as cool as the original Chemical Plant, and the music does kind of change to sounding much more retro, not necessarily like a Genesis sound chip or anything, but you can definitely see where these are influenced by the older Sonic levels. I just wish that these classic Sonic sections just felt more like classic Sonic, if that makes sense. But after you complete certain levels and progress through the game, Team Sonic will eventually begin taking over some portions of Eggman's army, and you basically liberate the world and free everybody or everything that's there, I guess. Getting into some of the boss fights, one of the coolest boss fights is Eggman himself, Dr. Robotnik. And this is very clearly a throwback to some of the classic boss fights from the first Sonic games. But once again, just like Sonic Colors, there isn't much variety in boss fights. You do fight Zavik at certain points, and I thought this boss fight was pretty cool. It's a bit easy. I mean, the boss fights are quite simple. The final boss was a little bit challenging, but the bosses in this game were just fairly simple. So there's Zavik defeated, and I thought he was one of the cooler bosses. Metal Sonic is always a cool boss too, but it's basically just you boost, and then when the prompt shows up for the homing attack, you just mash a button. And then afterwards you boost again, and then you just keep mashing buttons. Eventually, Metal Sonic will form a whole ring of projectiles surrounding him, and you have to take all of those down first before you can get to Metal Sonic. But Metal Sonic didn't provide much of a challenge. It would have been cooler to just race him instead. And then when you fight Infinite, you basically just do exactly the same thing. I mean, yeah, his attacks are a little bit different, but the main basis of the boss fight is exactly the same. And once again, you have to do a double boost in order to defeat Infinite. So instead of delivering a big final blow, you just kind of trigger a cutscene and just do it that way. So Infinite and Metal Sonic are pretty identical in terms of how you fight them. Speaking of bosses that are quite identical, after you defeat Eggman for the first time, he activates the Egg Dragoon. And then when you fight the Death Egg robot in the last mission, you basically just kind of do the same thing. So once again, the lack of variety in boss fights is kind of lame, but the Death Egg robot was kind of cool though, because you do get to see the destruction of this big giant robot. And since this is the final boss, there are multiple phases. But the second phase was quite easy. You have to dodge some rockets, and then this big hand comes down. But since I used the Burst Wispon, oh sorry, it's the Flamethrower Wispon, it was just kind of easy. Like, you just survived 3 waves. And then there's the third phase, like a Resident Evil game or something like that. And this one was a little bit more challenging. Of course, all 3 characters, your Avatar, Classic Sonic, and Modern Sonic, are all teaming up to take this one guy down, the Death Egg robot. But he shoots out the lasers, you have to dodge the, and then you just kind of boost up to him and then attack him when the homing attack shows up by mashing a single button. This one was a bit tougher though, because you did have to actually dodge his attacks, and those attacks were pretty lethal. I mean, you had to dodge them. You couldn't just kind of take a hit, get invincibility for a few frames, and then rush forward and attack him again. But outside of the main story missions, which there's 30 levels in the game, but they're pretty short. You can beat this game in like 5 hours. There's also these special stages, which basically just give you like obstacles, like the exploding blocks or the vanishing blocks here. It's just kind of like challenge maps, and that's about it. I think my biggest complaint about Sonic Forces is just the lack of replayability. In Sonic Colors Ultimate, you had a reason to play through the levels again, because if you wanted to play as Super Sonic, you had to collect all the red rings. Collecting all the red rings granted you the Game Land, and after completing all the Game Land levels, you could play as Super Sonic. And playing through that game as Super Sonic is pretty cool. And there's also the Wisps, and the Wisps gave you maybe 3 or 4 different ways to play through each level. If you play through the level, there's always 3 or 4 different routes you can take, or 3 or 4 different things you can do because of the Wisps. So the Wisps added a lot of replay value on top of that. But for Sonic Forces, once you finish the game, there's really no reason to get all the red rings and S ranks unless you really, really want to. Maybe for trophies or something like that, I don't know. Is Sonic Forces a bad game? No, not really. It's kind of lame, but I don't think it's bad. I think some of the hate this game gets is a bit unwarranted. I believe most of it comes from the fact that it came out just a couple of months after Sonic Mania, one of the greatest Sonic games ever, by the way. Sonic Forces is not a bad game. It's just not a great game either. I think this is maybe a 6 out of 10, but it's not bad.